Okay, starting my speech in three, two, and one. Three simple points. First, EU relationships are fucked because of this. Secondly, we think the capacity for it to aggress in South China Sea is also worse. And thirdly, I think the Russia-Ukraine war has worsened post-pandemic recovery for China and why that was bad for CCP. So, firstly, EU relationships are incredibly worse off on their side of the house, right? Why is that the case? The reason is because China is literally the only major superpower in the world supporting Russia in this war to a huge extent. Even other like larger countries, like for example India, have been largely agnostic about its support towards Russia, whereas China comparatively is actively aiding it in like maintaining trade policies, but also supplying Russia with key like weapons manufacturing parts, and even reportedly some weapons directly as well. And given that Russia doesn't have any other major allies to rely upon, the EU is uniquely pissed off because they know that if China withdraws its support, Russia is going to capitulate because it cannot maintain its war economy without being able to export massive amounts of oil, which is uniquely the specialized selling point of the Russian economy. The question then becomes, why was this a tipping point for EU relationships to sour? Because obviously countries do unsavory things all the time. The EU, for example, do have dealings with like other slightly questionable countries, but we think this was a tipping point for the EU to massively withdraw a lot of its cooperation with China for a few structural reasons. Firstly, I think uniquely the Ukraine-Russia war and the EU being pro-Ukraine is a unique point of consensus where every single EU country have consistently continued to back Ukraine, which makes it a uniquely pertinent issue. Secondly, I think that Russia is an extremely proximate threat to the EU, like it is literally sharing its borders, and if Ukraine uniquely capitulates, it means that other proximate nations are also under threat. Look to, for example, Poland, look to, for example, Finland, and so on and so forth. But I think thirdly, I think Russia has caused significant amounts of suffering by shutting down the North pipeline and just causing general energy crises and made massive amounts of people in the EU suffer during incredibly cold winters and not being able to access, for example, access heating, energy, and stuff like that. But also, I think the image of the EU as being a democratic entity that supports the sovereignty of different nations, and also critically, an organization that supports European countries, is damaged at the point in time. It allies itself with a nation that is literally supplying weapons parts to the country that is destroying all the EU stands for, right? So the bottom line is that this is going to piss off the EU and piss them off significantly, such that this has led to massive withdrawing of support for China. What does this look like? This looks like taking away trade deals. This looks like significant. This looks like upwards of 50% tariffs in place on certain Chinese products and a 48% tariff being placed specifically on the electric vehicle imports from China. This looks like no longer having certain things like military cooperation, etc., etc. We think this is generally like what the implications are, right? But why is this bad for the Chinese Communist Party? I think firstly it means trade worsens, and I want to note that China is uniquely an export-oriented nation. They have one of the largest deficits, I think, in the world, positive deficits in the world, and they really rely upon selling a lot of their products into very special products, especially because China is currently producing more high level, more refined products like the high level electronics versus just raw materials, which means they want to sell to a highly developed economy that has a demand for example, more refined products that are more expensive in nature. Given this, I think, given this, I think the EU is generally very important, but especially because regardless of this motion being implemented, the US has become incredibly anti-China, not just because of Trump, but also because of Biden. And we think Trump uniquely has exacerbated this insofar as he wants to decouple the US from the rest of the globalized economy. It means then China would have lost the US market in either side, but they also lose the EU market on their side of the house, the last remaining Western alternative for them to sell their products in, which is a massive trade harm that the CCP has to contend with, which means it loses money, it loses also the perception of being a global superpower they get with trading with the EU on their side of the house. But then secondly, the soft power of China as a nation also worsens. Note the CCP uniquely want to position China as an up-and-coming global superpower, but that becomes significantly more difficult when you're no longer invited to the geopolitical summits the EU used to invite you on, because now you're seen as being in the same league as Russia, who is the sworn enemy of the EU. It is no longer able to have Chinese vehicles being on the streets of Italy and people normalizing China as a major superpower, but rather seeing it as a rogue and pariah state. So we think that particular global CCP is also worse off on their side of the house. So we think then EU relationships worsen, and it's a significant policy issue for the CCP. Losing it has been devastating. Our second argument is about Taiwan and why it becomes significantly more difficult, and not just Taiwan, sorry, but like the South China Sea writ large, and why it becomes much more difficult to achieve military interests over there. Before I move on, I'll take a point from CEO.
Yeah, why does the EU divest from China? I might have missed it.
Yeah, Russia is currently omega fucking Ukraine, which is kind of pissing off EU, and because China is the only major power helping Russia keep their war efforts afloat, EU pissed off at China. Listen to my speech. You know what? I'll also take a PR from OO. Or no POI. So, argument then. The first reason why it has become more difficult for China to exert military control is that the Russian attack on Ukraine has led to militarization writ large across the world. Firstly, the EU is currently militarizing. Germany is expanding its share of GDP for its military budget, specifically because they're realizing that one, Russia is now a growing threat, but secondarily, specifically because the US is withdrawing support for NATO, these countries have to become more militarized and more self-dependent. The problem for CCP now is that this means that there's just simply more weapons in reserves, more stockpiles being built up. But this also extends beyond the EU, right? I think lots of local actors in the South China Sea, like for example Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, etc., or Philippines, also stockpiling resources because now the idea that a major global power could invade a country unprompted is now normalized, right? This hasn't been the case since Iraq when the US invaded Iraq, but and before Russia, people didn't think this would be possible, but that perception has changed, which means massive militarization in the localities in which China wants to exert control. For example, the militarization of countries in AUKUS, for example, I think are problems with the CCP. But the second reason this is bad is because information is now also created. What do I mean by that? Because the theater of war in Ukraine has brought massive degrees of innovation for how small powers can fight against big powers. Ukraine, despite massive resource shortages are finding innovative cost-effective ways using drone warfare to cause significant damages to a disproportionately more powerful foe such as Russia. This is information that Taiwan is able to use in their own defense, but this also inspires Taiwan and tells them that you can fight back against China despite being a much smaller country. Finally, I think the Indo-Russian war happened during 2022 when COVID was trying to recover within these worsened global supply chains. Once again, China wants to export shit. Supply chains being bad makes it more difficult to do that. More on that from DPM, but for all these reasons, very, very happy to propose.
Thank the speaker. Hello.
Three things in this speech. First, what does the CCP want and what is actually good for it? Second, why this is going to produce substantially cheaper critical goods for China and therefore help it with its current economic problems, and why this is critical to the CCP's continued power. And then finally, why this creates more leverage for China that it can leverage to achieve its geopolitical goals. So first, quickly on what the CCP wants and what's good for it. I think the primary desire of the CCP is to stay in power. What this requires is for the domestic political situation in China to remain stable. That looks like China having economic success. It has leverage over other countries. It's perceived broadly as a good guy and seen as like powerful and important. These are things that need to be believed not outside of China, but inside of China among their domestic population. They need to feel like the CCP is doing a good job. Also, I think the CCP, insofar as it's made up of people about China and people who have egos, want to see China just do really well and like rise to some sense of glory under the CCP's leadership. So I think that's what's good for the CCP is to stay in power and for China to rise to glory. Okay. Then on cheaper goods for China. I think that the main cheaper goods that China gets is they get a lot of really, really, really inexpensive oil and natural gas from Russia. Why is this critical? Well, oil and natural gas is still the foundation of most economies, including China's, and importantly, they inform the price of almost every other good in the economy. Because modern manufacturing processes, which is most of what China engage in, require substantial amounts of energy to operate, as does transportation, you basically need energy as an input to almost everything that your economy does. And while China is like rolling out solar panels eventually, that is still not the majority of their energy production. And the extent to which they can get cheap oil, but also cheap other goods that Russia exports is really important. What is important for the panel to understand is that the magnitude of the discount that China is receiving on critical Russian goods is enormous. There is almost no, like economics, goods are literally supply and demand. There is almost no demand for Russian goods from most other countries in the world because the condemnation and the sanctioning of Russia has been so widespread. As a result, China is able to buy Russian oil, to buy Russian natural gas, to buy Russian goods writ large at much, much, much cheaper prices. This is really important because the base level Chinese citizens are currently struggling. The economy of China is built on insane levels of debt that used to be supported by equally insane levels of growth. That growth was primarily driven by two things, both of which no longer apply. One, the growth of low value added manufacturing in China, basically making like plastic widgets for the US. The problem here is that Vietnam and other competitors in South Asia are now also spinning up substantial low value added manufacturing sectors as well, and they are in fact outcompeting China for two reasons. One, labor is not as cheap in China as it used to be. When you grow economically, people expect to be paid more as your economy grows. The wages of your average Chinese worker are rising. This makes them much less competitive. But two, the US is the primary consumer market for this sort of stuff, and they now hate China and is heavily sanctioning China. In fact, the EU analysis we get from OG actually even plays into this as well. Okay, great. Why is this then a problem? Well, the second thing that China was doing to keep their economy growing was building a shit ton of infrastructure. Problem, they built all the infrastructure. Every train they could possibly use, every home that they could possibly build, it's built. And now they have all these giant companies whose job it was to build infrastructure and who now have nothing left to do. What is the result? China is dealing with a very high youth unemployment rate and families and businesses who are crushed under mounting debt. Genuine economic recession is a major problem for the CCP. Why? Two main reasons. One, they have built their brand on insane economic growth that has occurred since the reforms of the 80s. They essentially push their authoritarian model and ground it to their civilians on the belief that the Chinese authoritarian system is a best for everyone. They say, look at your own family's wealth. Look at how much better things are for you now, particularly to people who matter in cities, and those people then support the system. If that economic growth fails, if China collapses, those people will blame the CCP. And critically, the way they will blame the CCP is that they will have removed the CCP's fundamental and most important claim to legitimacy. The second reason that a recession or other economic drawdown would be very, very bad for China is that democracies have a steam release valve when a recession happens, because people get really mad when they lose their jobs, when they lose their homes, when they are crushed under debt. Well, what do people do in a democracy? They vote the party out of power and life goes on. It feels like someone was accountable, someone paid. There is no way to release the pressure when, for the CCP, they can't get voted out of power. They can only get violently removed. It's not really even an option for them to do something like depose Xi Jinping. Again, their legitimacy is built on the structure of power that they have established, on this consensus control, on literally the Xi Jinping school of thought. Now, I'm not saying that literally but for the Russo-Ukrainian War, China would have had a revolution. That is obviously implausible. I'm saying instead two things. One, it heightens the risk of economic recession and then that potentially leading to domestic political instability. And any increase to that risk is bad for the CCP, who wants to be in as stable a place as possible. And two, that increased risk is in and of itself bad for them in the moment. That is, the more unstable the situation is, the deeper the CCP needs to go into debt, and the less agency that they have to do other unpopular things that they happen to want to do. I will now take a POI from closing. Opening?
If the war was so good for the Chinese economy, why is it in its greatest slump in about a decade?
Yeah, great point. China is not doing well right now. They had these massive COVID lockdowns where they basically shut down their entire economy. All of the things on infrastructure and all of the things on low value added manufacturing happen in either world. What that means is that what you are seeing is China's economy with the bump from the Russo-Ukrainian War. And if you didn't have that bump from the Russo-Ukrainian War, it would be much worse, potentially pushing them over the tipping point into a major recession, or at least having substantial risk of major recession, which, as I explained, any increase to that risk gives China less latitude. Finally, just on more leverage for China. Russia is only one of the only other major powers in Asia. CCP clearly wants China to be a massive hegemon. Because Russia is so dependent, because OG characterized that Russia is dependent on China, China now has Russia wrapped around their pinky finger. This is clearly good for them because the deal behind closed doors is obviously that China wants Russia to provide similar support in the event of Taiwan. The main deterrent to Taiwan is not like militarization on any level. They can crush like the other militaries in South Asia like gnats. They are worried about economic sanctions that will prevent them from selling goods, and having Russia wrapped around their finger secures access to resources and at least one consumer market in the event that they decide to invade Taiwan. Note that they also don't literally need to invade Taiwan in order to get these benefits. The more that China has the capacity to invade Taiwan, the more pressure they can put on Taiwanese parties, the more likely the KMT is to win elections, the more likely that Taiwan is to be conciliatory towards China, all of which are also things that the CCP wants because, again, they see everything as being united as one China. They should control it all. Okay, so proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker. Invite the DP. DPM. PM, could you please text your partner? And if they're not here in like 2 minutes and audible,
Hi,
there you
hi. I'm here. I'm having some internet issues. I wasn't able to hear the last 30 minutes of the previous speaker. Can I have 1 to 2 minutes to change my device?
Sure.
Thank you. Hello, am I audible? And am I clear though? Yeah, I just changed my device. Mm.
You're audible. You can start when.
Okay, okay. Two disclaimers before I start. If I get cut off in between my speech, contact my teammate. He will let me know. And regarding POS, ask POS through voice channel, preferably from closing, because I don't look at the text. That being said, um, three, two, one. Good. I think in O's case, there is a problem and solution mismatch because I agree with the problem that China has a dire need of fixing its economy because of the massive internal, let's say, economic crisis or because of the real estate bubble popping or youth unemployment rate and all of the stuff. So we agree on both sides of the house where economy progression is better. In which side of the house, that side of the house should win the debate at the first place, right? Before moving on to the arguments, I have two bits of framing. First, I think this Russia-Ukraine war have created a dichotomy for China at the first place. What is this dichotomy? That is, China have to choose between EU or Russia. They cannot maintain diplomatic relationship with both the countries, which they have done for decades previously at the first place. Why, in absence of war, they would not have to choose at the first place? Because even if they were somewhat close to Russia, EU would still maintain relationship with China at the first place because EU wants to maintain diplomatic relationship with China because US imposed tariff on EU and EU wants to access China's market because of the advanced EV market or China's manufacturing market, especially EU's countries are mostly consumer-based markets at the first place, which means they need China's product at the first place. But they also need access to China's natural gas, as China is the third largest producer of natural gas in the first place. Which means in absence of the Russia-Ukraine war, EU will maintain diplomatic relationship with China at the first place. But what happens when the Russia-Ukraine war started and China was a major lifeline to Russia? It became a moral imperative on EU to cut off or actively penalize China or cut off any trade deals with China at the first place, which means China suffers economically hugely at the first place, right? But let's take the worst case. Even in outside of the house, we have to defend totally losing Russia in outside of the house. We have EU and other countries dealing or having trades with China at the first place. Why it is better? Because Russia has very little to offer to China. Because Russia has been in huge economic debt for the past decade because of internal crisis, because of internal political chaos, because internal political crisis against Putin is continuously present within Russia at the first place. But internal government bureaucratic mismanagement means the debt to GDP ratio is very high for Russia at the first place. That's why even a bread in Russia costs very, very huge, and there is not enough basic amenities within Russia at the first place. But secondly, Russia has been sanctioned for a very, very long time, which means it do not have access to international like trade market support structures or support structures or supply chains at the first place. But also Russia is not a consumer based market, because China is a manufacturing based market. It needs countries which are consumer based market, right? So Russia do not fulfill the need of China at the first place, but China produces its own natural gas and oil at the first place. It do not need the exclusive access to Russia's oil at the first place. But even if they need access to oil, China have a very good relationship with Saudi Arabia, where they have exclusive bilateral deal with Saudi Arabia, which means that benefits that they can get from Russia, this can be accessed by Saudi Arabia and other alternative countries as well. Meaning, even if we completely lose Russia in outside of the house, we are extremely fine with that. Versus EU is a much better alternative, because EU's market is a much bigger market, and having trade alliances with EU provides you a sense of international legitimacy, which allows you to create an international like expansionist mentality or international hegemony, or allows you to penetrate into international institutions of the first place, right? Now I'm going to talk about global supply chain shock, right? There are two layers under this. For why Russia-Ukraine war caused a global supply shock chain at the first place. Because sanctions on Russia meant transport of oil coming from Russia to EU and other countries stopped, meaning oil prices in general rose, which means global transport and shipping of any manufacturing products coming from China risen, which means countries stopped buying from China at the first place. But secondly, most countries or industries had to relocate their manufacturing hub from China to other Indo-Pacific Asian countries like Vietnam and Philippines, which means China lost huge customers or huge trade deals with other countries like EU, with South Latin American countries like Brazil, with Asian countries like Vietnam. This impacts China because China primarily depends on manufacturing countries, right? But secondly, this relocation of manufacturing hubs mean China now face incredible competition, and their products are not at competitive at the first place. The harms is all of the harms O talks about, like millions of jobs being lost, destroying trade relationship with significant countries, meaning losing leverage on a global level, which is important for CCP, because leverage would have been used to do projects, long-term projects of CCP, like OBR project, using which CCP maintains its legitimacy. The weighing of this argument is, in the context where China's real estate bubble was burst, it needed this initial capital head start to get back. It hinges on manufacturing industry to get back from crisis like this. But secondly, the rising wage of middle class Chinese people needed to be met by this manufacturing industries, which was not met. Lastly, I want to talk about EU, right? Why EU will actually diverge. China has a pivotal role in keeping Russia afloat in this Russia-Ukraine war, because of the sanctions imposed on Russia, all of the supply chains were cut off from Russia. Means for getting access to supply chain to arms and all of trade deals, Russia exclusively depends on China at the first place. Meaning EU knows that China holds the lifeline of Russia, but China is not doing anything, which means EU becomes massively pissed off and massively divest away and penalize China after this war. Meaning this looks like EU imposing tariffs on the primary selling of China, which is the EV. This looks like US imposing 125% tariff on China, China losing its biggest consumer market. It needed EU to replace US at the first place. EU has $300 billion of product surplus of China, which means you lose $300 billion of products that you could have sold to EU market at the first place, right? The comparative is when Russia-Ukraine war do not start, US acts as whole with EU. EU and China forms massive trade reliance. In response to that, CCP is able to get away with a lot of shady things like operation on Uyghurs because it has the backing of EU in outside of the house. Lastly, on South China and Taiwan, I think Russia-Ukraine war allowed US and EU to remilitarize, invest in NATO, increase military presence in Pacific Ocean, meaning invading Taiwan and South China Sea became much harder at the first place. But the hatred created against China meant previously no Western countries openly supported Taiwan, but now more and more EU countries started recognizing Taiwan, which is hugely harmful for CCP because it can no longer openly invade against Taiwan at the first place. That means it is worse for CCP in all fronts. Proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Would now like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to do the top half.
Give me 1 second for my papers. Okay. I'm going to assume that everybody's ready unless somebody says something now. And I'm going to begin starting on my first word, which is now. First, let's just handily deal with OG's frankly ridiculous argument that the EU has drastically cut off relationships with China because of the fact that they're letting sanctions break through. First, important piece of characterization. China is not going out there saying, hey, we're actually going to make sure with all of our military might that Russia is going to win. Yes, they've shown some bias. Yes, they've been allowing them to skirt sanctions, but it is not the same geopolitically as announcing this massive level of support that they say is happening. Meaning the EU has a way out of dropping massive sanctions, which is part of why they haven't. I think it's fairly important to notice what actually happened in the status quo. And China has basically avoided most of the harm from the EU sanctioning them and actually not paying attention or giving them their resources. The EU cannot afford to give up Chinese goods. Why? Europe's economy is growing super slowly. People make much less money than in the US. And so these people really need cheap Chinese goods or this economy cannot growing. So the EU's incentive to reject is not actually that high, especially due to the fact that they have a really good relationship with China on some really important categories. In terms of EU really wants to grow green. They say EU really doesn't like Russia. I think the EU pushing for anti-climate change legislation is maybe the thing that the world has most agreed on generally, and it's therefore more important, or at least as important. The only way that they have to this green transition is the fact that China is leading electric car and solar panel producer. EU really wants China to come back to the table because they're such an important partner and they're failing without them. So they're giving trade back to China in response to even small concessions by China towards Europe. This is actually another win. Mark this, Judge. This is another point that you can vote for us in terms of China actually gets more influence over the EU in our world because Europe is forced to come to the bargaining table for even small concessions from China about literally anything due to the fact that the EU is far more desperate for that relation. Meaning that China can just be like, we'll cut off a few little bits of trade. And then the EU gives up massive concessions overall. China also separately is fine without them. In terms of China can survive sanctions from the EU specifically pretty easily in terms of they used to be much more dependent on large export markets than they are now. Other countries outside of the EU and the US are growing and increasing their demand for Chinese goods. China has taken all their infrastructure companies and started building stuff in the developing world as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. We're all debaters. You all know what that is. They're making active efforts to leverage anti-US sentiments to gain influence in the developing world and basically create a market for their goods. That is already succeeding on a massive scale and is why China is not relying on these things anymore. But also, guess what? Their market is expanding outside of this like export-based manufacturing. It's part of why China is so much bigger than a lot of these countries like Vietnam that are still reliant on it. What does this look like? In terms of China's own domestic market has been growing rapidly as they urbanize. Their middle class is growing, meaning that if they make it through these current economic tribulations, they don't necessarily need the EU long term, especially as they develop more advanced manufacturing techniques, and they have access to rare earth metals that are not necessary for most advancing technologies in the rest of the world, meaning that they have massive amounts of influence in a key way without having to do this export-based manufacturing to have massive amounts of success. It's part of why we've seen them have this massive growth that other countries have completely, utterly lacked. This is also why gonna extend some shit Seamus told you that I think is really important. This is why it is so crucial right now that we don't let China go into, or that for the CCP, China doesn't go into a recession right now. In terms of the fact that they are at a turning point and they are starting to develop a middle class, they're starting to develop large amounts of people who are not relying on this export-based manufacturing. How do we actually let this transition occur? By giving people cheap enough goods to buy. What's the hardest part of the transition for export-based manufacturing countries? It is the fact that their currency is worth less than the other countries, meaning exporting is very cheap, but importing is much more expensive. So therefore, they need cheap goods far more than they need anything else, because right now they're trying to transition into a better economy. And the only way that they can do that is that people can actually afford the base resources they need. That is why Russia is so key. Remember, Russia has access to massive amounts of oil to the point that the EU has had a hard time cutting them off. China gets to just get all this cheap oil, as Seamus explained to you, supply, demand. Low demand, really cheap fucking oil that actually allows their citizens to continue being happy with the government. Remember, Seamus told you what the CCP wants, which is specifically they like having a positive influence over their people. They like them believing in them. That's really important for their stability as a government long term, and specifically their legitimacy as a non-democratic regime. Remember this argument. I think that it's something that's likely to be ignored by other teams in the round, which is they are not a democracy. They do not get legitimacy in the same way. They get legitimacy through the economic benefits to their citizens, meaning that if and as those stops, it is hugely problematic and difficult. So they need to allow their citizens to continue affording things, or they will lack the support that they want desperately and need desperately. Plus, this recession is just like bad for them, and we think it's incredibly likely. Remember, something that OG and OO agree on actually is the fact that China has been in a massive downturn. Seamus gave you much better reasons than OG did for why this downturn is happening, which is the fact that they did massive COVID lockdowns that have posed a huge problem in the nation, and to do the downtrend of this export-based manufacturing, and they're trying to replace it. This is how they're going to survive the transition many other countries have failed. It is why they are still afloat and functioning as well as they are in the modern economy. Therefore, we're saving them from something that so many other countries have suffered. Therefore, they're avoiding this recession that would be bad for their people, bad for their legitimacy as a government, and therefore this is the most important point in the round. Wait, this is about everything else. I'll take a POI from closing if there is one.
Yeah, you explain why there's going to be low demand. Why will there be high supply?
Sorry, repeat that.
You explain low demand. Why will there be high supply?
Russia has so much oil, dude. Like that's like the thing about Russia. That's like why they've succeeded. It's why the EU kept taking their oil even after they first invaded Ukraine, because they couldn't figure out how to like have energy otherwise, and they had to do like a lot of planning. Russia supplies so much of the world's oil, dude. It's like Saudi Arabia and Russia is really close and easy to get to. So like, yeah, Russia has the supply, and as Seamus told you, the people are actually most of the time using this gas for their basic energy needs that they need to just like survive and function. Okay, so let's do some random stuff now that we've really thoroughly proven to you why we're winning this round in terms of what's most important, why this recession is likely, and why it's particularly bad for the CCP. First, I'm going to tell you why this also benefits China in the Arctic Circle in terms of China is able to explore the Arctic for resources, as they're often doing with Russia right now. They had economically collaborated, but now they have far more influence over Russia because Russia is not the one like with the military capacity, so China can threaten them both militarily as well as in terms of economically. They have far more influence because Russia needs them in order to be able to do this research into these highly like resource-rich areas that exist in the Arctic, meaning that China's oftentimes getting a head start on getting the resources that other people have and getting a really favorable deal with Russia that they wouldn't be able to bargain otherwise. This is huge for them long term, and it's also huge for the country right now in terms of what citizens actually need. Let's finish this stage by giving you quick reasons to preempt CG of why the U.S. is always going to hate China. Why? The U.S. is going to hate China anyway, because the fact that it's the main enemy on their international stage and has been for years. The U.S. has done so much like propaganda and not propaganda about the authoritarian Chinese government and how awful it is and how TikTok's watching you. Guys, TikTok's under your skin. It's watching you. And that means that they can't just go back on it and still get elected. It's been literally every politician's platform. Plus, there's heavily threatened by China on the international stage as the main other economic component. So therefore, they're not just going to go, woo, actually we love China because of this, or we hate China because of this. They already do. Urge you to vote. Oh.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Would like to now invite the member of government to extend the case for side gov.
Just to check I am audible, visible. Let me just move my screen back. I'm using online notes, so I can't see the chat. Please just give verbal POIs. I'll definitely try and take one from opening. Probably around the 5-minute mark. I don't know. Starting my speech. Actually, 1 second. Let me just adjust my notes. I can actually see them. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sorry, we're not running an argument about the US. 2 contributions from CU that win this debate. Firstly, actually mechanizing why this leads to massive economic sector harms for Russia, responding to and weighing out China responding to and weighing out OG. Secondly, a vertical how the Russo halves to China, for example, in the EU market, much better than what OG gives. Firstly, economic sector harms. We're going to give actual mechanisms as to why Russia being in this war is so bad for China. Few of them. Number 1, I'd like to note that Russia exports a lot of oil to China. is right. It's about supply and demand, but there is no supply. The pipelines in Russia have been shut down insofar as they're literally getting bombed by Ukrainian drones, by American strikes, because that's the most strategic place to hit. Production has gone down because all the able-bodied men who could have manned the spots are literally going to war. Boats and steel and electricity supplies are going into war weapons, not oil weapons, in an attempt to win the front. They're not going towards trivially increasing the produce of oil, as far as that is not what right now. Russia needs to stop having their men die and stop having their land seized by Ukrainian troops, especially given, furthermore, there is still demand. Because OO seems to assume the world is just the EU and the US. There's still countries like India who are able to skirt tariffs by buying up Russian oil with other crude while still trying to buy up the produces that Russia gives. I'm unclear why oil just necessarily goes to China. I think OO agrees with us as to why oil is important. I'm not going to do the weighing there. But note also, secondly, Russia just doesn't have a huge amount of oil left. It's running out rapidly of its existing reserves. Most of its oil prediction charts come from assumptions that Russia will be able to access the currently no man's land in the Arctic and the oil contained underneath. The issue is, insofar as Russia is currently acting in a war and killing civilians in Ukraine, there's no incentives for international organizations to give Russia parts of the Arctic. I don't think that, actually, China has a lot of alternatives. It doesn't have alternatives in Saudi, and so they have much closer relations with the USA than they do with China. I think OG is just empirically lying. I think I can contradict in that case. But secondly, they're also geographically much closer to Russia. You have things like shared pipelines and collaboration agreements. There are less frictional costs to get the oil to your country in the first place. Secondly, China is giving more to Russia than Russia gives to it right now, and probably in the long term. Know that Russia losing the war will be very, very bad for China for like 20 reasons. Number 1, the precedent it sets shows that smaller countries can overthrow larger ones. It boosts confidence in the West and boosts confidence in places like Taiwan, because they can say, look what Ukraine did. They fought against an imperial power using many of the same rhetoric as our Chinese overlords are doing right now. We can do the same. We can do the same way. Secondly, the US scope just expands because now, for example, Ukraine is more reliant on the West and reliant on things like US support, things like aid from the US, whether financial or military. So the amount of power the US has extends further eastwards, which just causes internal harms for the CCP. Thirdly, as I've said already, if the Russia loses, there are massive economic harms. You lose oil, you lose a consumer base, Russia faces sanctions. There are very little other options for a large consumer market that is so close to you that you don't need to pay on shipping costs, and where your leaders are so ideologically united. You have linked infrastructure projects, linked train lines, linked oil pipelines, which is very, very bad if Russia loses and if Russia pull investment out of, because then you have to take over operations. If Russia can't support them, you just lose access to these things in the first place. Fifthly, it's one of the very few military allies you have. Russia has sea rights for areas of things specific you don't want to lose war, not be able to support these. But those are just bad. The past, this did look like a winnable, but now it looks a lot more sketchy. The issue is,
Hey, can we pause? I believe you're like really cracking up. Like I can catch every alternate word. So maybe we should like to all turn off our videos. I think maybe that's it.
Do you want me to turn off my video as well?
Yeah, I think so. That would be more useful if that's okay with you.
When did I start cutting off?
The last thing I had you say, so I had you at 3 minutes 20 seconds, and the last thing I heard you say was that Russia is one of the only military allies that China has.
Okay, vibes. Okay, cool. I'll just continue from there. Everyone ready? 3, 2, 1. No, that Russia is one of the very few military areas you have. It has sea rights over areas of the Pacific Sea, which are often strategically useful for shipping routes and things like extending your dominance over the South China Sea. But sixthly and lastly, there's also a sunk cost fallacy. In the past, this did look like a winnable war for Russia, but now it looks a lot more sketchy. But the issue is with China, you've already staked your reputation on the line. You've given a huge amount of money to Russia. Pulling out now leads to the worst of both worlds. We are not able to curry favor either with the West or with Russia. You just need to hope you can win this and try and sip it out. But China is trying its hardest to try and make Russia win the war, but it's getting harder and harder. NATO have bumped up their defense spending. The US is getting more and more aggressive and returning to an interventionist approach. The body bag effect is happening in Russia, and people are literally marching in the streets against Putin. What does this mean for China? It means that not only does China give a lot more than it actually gets from Russia right now, and probably in the future, I posit Russia is likely to lose the war for all the reasons I've given above, and further which the fact that its economy is literally plummeting. It's very hard to win a war when your economy is not salient, but also because China has literally ended up bankrolling Russia. Russia needs loans to be able to operate militarily, but the issue is its assets have been freezed and it has no way to access the global market. So in order to be able for Russia to be able to keep buying up things, China has been taking out international loans to lend out money to Russia. But this is really bad because there are very speculative returns on these loans, as the global currency market and bond market knows, which is there are very, very high interest rates on these loans. And also things like people just like stop investing in your bonds and stop investing in your currency of the yuan because they don't feel like you're going to be stable in the long run. But also what you're doing is you're giving Russia things like mineral reserves. You're giving them things like rare earth metals for drones, which are probably all the comparative things you want to keep. You need them for manufacturing of things like solar panels, which are currently your most competitive export. Thirdly, you lose a strategic export ally. I'm going to explain and actually give mechanisms to why the Russian propensity to consume has gone down. Number one, Russia has been disconnected from the global financial SWIFT system. It needs to go through a lot more barriers in order to do things like buy and trade with China and access things like, for example, dollars, which are usually traded in because they are more stable. Given Russia can't access its global cash reserves because its assets have been freezed, the vast majority of trades happen to things like complex derivative foreign exchange swaps, which aren't very supportable, aren't very easy to access. Secondly, most government buying is things like military technology. Oligarchs who produce tanks, and more spending becomes internal and trying to buy up things like weapons and buy up things like ammunition in order to be able to fight Ukraine. Thirdly, the economy just goes down for normal war reasons, sanctions and bond selling as interest rate spikes. But fourthly, more and more people are getting sent to the main front. Russia can't afford to lose people. Russia has quite a large population, but also Putin isn't reasonable. He's sending a lot of people in the front to try and literally brute force out the problem. So not only does it mean that a massive amount of people are dying, a massive amount of people who are working like age are dying, but it also means that the main breadwinner for many families back in the cities in Moscow and back in the cities in St. Petersburg are losing their money. So the overall Russian propensity to buy consumer goods, which is what China exports, is very, very bad. I'll take the PY from OG quickly.
Problems with Russia's future oil supply in 15 years don't affect how good this is for China right now, especially because Ukraine's bombing of pipelines have all been pipelines to Europe because their weapons obviously can't reach that far into Asia.
But it's awful for it right now for all the mechanism I gave. If all your people are dying on the front in Kiev, you can't have them manning the oil pipelines. But why is this bad? Right now, China needs a lot of consumer confidence because of things like the Evergrande crash, because of things like COVID and current inflation taking place in order to stimulate the economy. But note also, the Chinese public response to the Russo-Ukrainian war makes this compounding. People feel more unstable in the economy in China. They're less likely to go out and spend if they feel they might be facing a crisis later. They're much likely to save that money. Quickly, second extension as to how the responses to the Russo-Ukrainian war lead to subsequent harms on China. I'd like to note very quickly that the EU response to the Russo-Ukrainian war and its response to DLO goes further than just the EU thinking, you support Russia, because it's empirically untrue that all countries support Ukraine. The narratives the EU forms in trying to respond to Russia leads to it trying to bind itself together. This either looks like A, emotional narratives designed to tie the EU together with images of a unified Europe, or B, concrete economic policies in an attempt to maintain coherence within the EU. This looks like tariffs on certain manufacturing industries, both to please powerhouses like Germany and smaller countries such as Hungary. These things lead to things like growing EU protectionism, greater fear, 100% tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles that lead to a trade war. This is just awful for China economically. Give it to CG.
Thank the speaker for the remarks. We'd now like to invite the member of opposition to extend the case.
Hello, is it okay if I turn my camera on, or would you prefer not, just for like connection things?
I think we can turn our cameras on.
Okay, sorry, my laptop's kind of old. It takes a second to load. My name is Kira. I'll be a member of government in terms of, member of opposition. In terms of POI preferences, I won't be looking at the chat. So just verbally, I'll ask for one around 5 minutes, preferably from opening. I might not accept you if you ask earlier, but I'll prompt one. If opening doesn't have one, closing can feel free to ask one instead. Okay, let me get my timer. Okay, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. First, some very brief responses to CG. I think that first of all, gut check their case. Why would Russia have like all of this leverage over China? They're obviously getting more desperate within their conditions because China's position is more favorable. I don't understand their case. But then second of all, I think that their case also, I think, mismanages to what degree you are trading with Russia. You're probably not going to fuck over your economy just to give them some amount of loans and take out all these international loans like they tell you just to give them some amount of loan. It's probably just favorably trading when it is beneficial because this is literally what China's economic policy is when engaging with other countries. They trade with basically every country. Okay, let's get to the extension of CO. We're first going to tell you about domestic legitimacy and why this is necessarily better post-war. I think this flips OG by showing why China comparatively has better perception post-war. The reason why is because the war solves the legitimacy crisis that exists in China by giving narratives of stability amid this like very chaotic situation within Western countries. This can show the hypocrisy of Western nations. You can look at like Trump, like not giving a fuck about like all these citizen deaths in Ukraine and stuff like that, not actually doing things to try to end the war and stuff like that. Same with NATO being incompetent versus looking at China, which has a better alternative for these individuals, which doesn't have these narratives of chaos, war, and all of these things that are embedded within these Western countries. I think CC propaganda can contrast this to the calm that exists within China to propagate them as a better actor that is more likely to defend individuals. I also think that any economic downturn internally can probably be blamed on Western actors because they're creating this scarcity. They're hurting all this international economic situation with all of these countries because of the war that is occurring. So you have this narrative that it's not your fault, where even if people believe that there is some instability in China, they say it's not our fault. It's not because of our own domestic issues. Next, we're going to fill in the OO gap by explaining necessarily why China's economy is so likely to benefit and so appealing to external actors to get investment. They kind of just say, oil is good. So why does China necessarily handle shocks better than fragile democracies or weaker countries, leading a lot of countries to turn to them? And also note that this flips CG because we talk about how you get European capital flight that goes into China. For MEX for this, first of all, you have a crisis government advantage because of speed and centralization. The CCP can flip policies within days without a lot of red tape or long legislative sessions. This means in crises that they respond very, very quickly. Western democracies have very difficult challenges within courts and electoral cycles, which means that they're very slow and very noisy responses. So it's hard to be able to protect these countries and have necessarily more of a stable economic situation. But then second of all, there's a greater state capacity to absorb these shocks. The local governments can even run at losses to maintain their output because they have a very centralized government. The centralized government can deal with these losses via policies and the centralized banks and things like that. But the party can still make sure they're getting these critical industries and output that they need, even if it is within a loss, within downturn economic times. So I think that there's probably going to be output continuity under this, which means that China is a very reliable supplier for these individuals, even in crises. But then third, I think that they have information control, which means that you probably can stabilize expectations of investors and stuff like that. This means that you can minimize panic and craft narratives that the economic pain is like temporary, or like I told you, it's externally caused by a lot of these Western narratives and stuff like that, which means that you're not going to have as much consumer and investor panic that often spirals within these Western nations. You keep to have very high confidence. But I think fourth of all, China's just a very important supply lender on the global stage. When war and sanctions disrupt these supply chains, a lot of these individuals seek reliability, which I've already told you why China's economy is very reliable, but also they just have a lot of manufacturing capacity. They're like one of the largest world exporters and stuff like that. I think that when their manufacturing ecosystem is very dense, they have, inputs, logistics, labor, and all of these things you need to have a successful economy. This just means that a lot of countries rely on them within this asset, but also like they have important vital resources like deep space, like the metals you need for like technology and stuff like that, which other countries uniquely don't, which means that it positions them in a unique place that there's likely to be heavy economic investment. The economic impacts of this are twofold. First of all, EU capital flight will strengthen the CCP's comparative legitimacy. Wars and sanctions within the EU means that these economies within the EU suffer energy shocks, inflation, and just general insecurity. This means that a lot of companies and investors want to move to safer markets that exist within China now. Some of this flow will ultimately flow within China because it has lower inflation, large bond markets, and these very strong export-oriented sectors that other teams have conceded on within the round. They want to invest within China's manufacturing base when you see European energy costs rising because of this war, which means you gain a lot of economic power. I think that the CCP can frame this as posturing against the Western weakness within this narrative. They have international confidence, increase flowing in, which means you probably increase the CCP's legitimacy both on a world-like view and also internally as well. I think that like they can posture the narrative that even when Europeans trust their markets more than their own governments on these times of crises, it's going to be very good for their narrative. I think this flips OG because rather than China being isolated, I think that you're actually likely to get a lot of capital inflow by showing the comparative trust in Chinese stability. I'll take a POI from opening if they have one.
Many of the economic downturns of China are caused specifically because of excess economic overheating. For example, the housing bubble, driven by low energy prices, what happened because of overdevelopment, leading to ghost cities that Chinese people definitely know isn't the West's fault.
Right. I don't think this interacts with the case because this isn't the type of economic development that I'm talking about when it necessarily comes to narratives than manufacturing, energy, and stuff like that. I don't think this responds to the fact that they're still able to posture these narratives that the European countries and these Western democracies aren't able to maintain their own supplies of energy and stuff like that. And this is going to be a lot better. Sure, the Chinese society can have like other problems, but there are still other narratives that they can blame on Western nations for becoming worse as they posture themselves as better, gain more economic power. This doesn't interact. And then second of all, I think the second economic impact of this is that you probably increase the global South's involvement within China's economy. I think that China then becomes a credible alternative to Western hypocrisy because now you're neutral and, necessarily anti-imperialist. You're more pragmatic for these individuals because you have a more stable economy that's not likely to, go back on these individuals. These Western commitments are quite fragile. You can partner with new countries. I think I've given you some X for these personally. I think that many countries within the global South are quite skeptical of the Western narrative on Ukraine. They often see it as a proxy war and stuff like that. A lot of states don't want to trade with these Western powers and move to trading more towards China because of these necessarily contradictory narratives that surround them. So the CCP can portray itself as a champion of like multipolar order and unite with the global South. I think this gives them like a lot of economic power and stuff like that. China becomes more respected globally and not isolated. What does this change in economic investment result in? I think China has unique leverage to then bully other countries because as a lot of Southeast nations, specifically within like the Indo-Pacific region, like the Philippines and places like that, start to rely on China. China then has more leverage to bully them when they have no alternative. But then B, I think it just validates Chinese propaganda narratives among citizens. They don't want to listen to Western criticism of things like Uyghur Muslims and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Xinjiang mistreatment, because if the United States and all these Western countries are able to violate their own narratives and commit these human rights violations, why the fuck do they care about Western criticism of their own domestic problems? It probably boosts their propaganda. So happy to oppose.
Thank the speaker for their remarks. Would now like to invite the Gov Whip.
Hi, just give me 5 seconds. I'm gonna go grab some water. Fatima Hiham, I will take POIs and chart. Please do not interrupt me at any point. The positioning of extension from CG will be incredibly simple. There are 3 things that I want to point out. The first thing I want to point out is that extension is incredibly certain in position to what OG gives you, because OG tells you that the EU views China as evil at the point at which China has decided to align with Russia and fund its like war machine. I think O does a kind of decent job of pointing enough doubt at this by going, oh well, it isn't like they haven't necessarily fully supported Russia in this venture or whatever. Like it's still like a low-key strategic alliance, and in the case that that is true, it's unlikely as to how much the EU is going to do this, given that there's still low-key cheap goods that they are able to get from China and have access to that. I think that makes that situation very uncertain. It is also unclear as to why the tariffs are necessarily a byproduct of what OG says, rather than what O would posit, which is that like there are a variety of other reasons, as O tells you about, like having domestic industries and things like that. So it is unclear at the end of that as to which part of that should win. What we tell you is that there is a very direct economic incentive, which is that you literally trade a fuck ton with Russia at the point at which the vast majority of Russia's resources are either directed internally at manufacturing tanks in order to go fight in the fields, or all of their able-bodied men are not working in like in the oil industry or in buying things because they are on the battlefield, which famously you want to be like using less money for, but also that you have a sunk cost fallacy in the amount of loans that you have given them over the years since the invasion in Crimea, genuinely just means that this is a very direct economic harm that you face at the point at which this happens, which not only harms you, like and not only just like harms you, but also harms the investor confidence, which is like an argument that CEO wants to posit in the long run. The second thing I want to deal with is what CEO says in response to our case. Their responses are twofold. The first thing they say is that there is no pressure that Russia exerts on China. Even if it is true that Russia exerts no pressure on China, it is not about what sort of pressure they exact or what sort of geopolitical like machinations are going on here. It is literally the fact that Russia purchases a lot of things from China, because like Russia primarily uses China as in order to get access to things like rare earth minerals, which it needs in order to manufacture its own weapons facilities and things like that. But also because but also it uses China in order to be able to access goods in the first place. And I think those are and like loans also, which means Russia is largely dependent on China, and China is also largely dependent on Russia insofar as it again allows it access to the Black Sea. It allows it access to like those trade routes. It allows it access to one of the best militaries in the world, because the Chinese military, the PLA, doesn't famously like intervene or have large amounts of like military perceptions and not positions in the vast majority of countries, which means that China does have a sunk cost fallacy in the worst case in Russia, because it has historically funded things like infrastructure projects within it, and therefore now must face the costs of that. Because if the war in Russia, if the war in Ukraine fucking fails, that means all of those years of development have like they lose a lot of money out, and that's why they must keep funding Russia in this particular way. But also empirically speaking, China has given, I think, like $6 or $7 billion US in loans to Russia in order to fuel this spending. And the reasoning for that is because Russia doesn't have access to the global financial system, because they've been sanctioned a lot. The assets of their leaders have been frozen, which means that they need this money in order to militarily function and actually fight the war in the first place, which is probably important for China, because like the war in Ukraine being lost is going to be pretty fucking evil, even on like optics level of a big country losing to a really, really small democratic country. That's the thing that helps us cement our extension. Let's deal with CO's two cases. The first thing they say is that what they say is essentially that you become the source of stability in the economic global system, which means that the vast majority of capital that flies away from Europe comes to China. Three problems. Problem one, why is it clear that there is going to be massive capital flight from EU? It is empirically untrue that this has happened, but also the EU has diverse sources of energy that it uses. Like France, for example, is completely nuclear, but even countries like Germany are shifting towards nuclear energy insofar as, and like not nuclear energy, but like necessarily cleaner forms of energy, insofar as like being environmentally sustainable is one of the two things that the EU for some reason does. But also secondly, it is unclear as to why all this money that is just flying from the EU is not going to more safer havens like the US, which have a democracy, which famously investors do value, because you aren't, for example, taking the fucking boss of Alibaba and like throwing him out, which is something China famously did. Because not having a system of checks and balances just means that investors have no fucking idea what's going to happen. Yes, you can take good decisions and have less red tape, but it's unclear as to why you're going to use that in a good way to boost the economy and like help out people. And to like boost the economy, but also like China's lack of transparency and the ways in which federal governments and local governments function, which led to like the Evergrande crash, has already depressed investor confidence. So it's unclear as to why investors are going to go to China. I think that case was. Let's deal with O case. I think O has the big case of cheaper goods, and then they wanted to run this like Russia wrapped around your fingers case. Let's deal with the cheaper goods case. I have 4 big responses here, but the first thing I want to point out at the top of this is that it is unclear as to why demand has really plummeted as much, which leads to these cheaper prices. Not only because there has been the relabeling of tankers that have been going towards Russia, but also more importantly, that have been going out of Russia, but also more importantly because Russian demand in countries like India and in countries within Latin America and Africa has not actually gone down, because that's the vast majority of the world. I think those are reasons for why those countries are still able to demand this, but the supply has gone down insofar as the vast majority of funding from the Russian state has gone away from these places. Even if that is not true, the amount of loans that you have to give to Russia, for the reasons that Maya tells you, the loss in trade as a result not only of people literally dying and not being able to buy things, but also the fact that Russia being cut off from the SWIFT global financial system means that in order to exchange money across borders has become really difficult, because you you can't go through the same systems anymore. You have to go through often really complex derivatives, like foreign exchange swaps on the currency market, which means that it's very, very difficult for you to be able to offset any possible benefits that you get from oil supply with trade. But even if it is true that oil supply is the most important thing, worst case, I'd say that oil prices in recent years have generally been pretty fine, but even in with like OPEC, and you're able to export that in the worst case, like very worst case. This entire case of Russia is wrapped around your fingers is simply untrue. It's unclear as to why this is the tipping point. Russia in general has lost a lot of the advantages it had, so it's unclear what the tipping point is. But also, like, having military alliances in Taiwan doesn't feel like a real impact because you're not going to invade them. It's very speculative and just doesn't happen. I think the reason that we win is because OG's harm may happen, but it is unclear as to why it happens for the reasons that are detailed in the motion. CG presents to you a harm that is clear, certain, and a direct impact.
Thank
Proud
you
to propose.
for the speech. Would now like to invite the op whip to give the last speech of the round.
Okay, cool. I'll call on POI, but you can feel free to raise your hand or like, I don't know, start waving at me. Gov needed to prove that the volatility you have from war, i.e., all of the things they talk about, things like sanctions, energy shocks, supply chains, inflationary harms, whatever, are actively harming the CCP more than they help. And OO needed to place these sorts of benefits that they're getting in terms of oil or whatever sort of economic leveraging against a lot of these harms. Maybe they have some sort of net margin, but it seems very insignificant and relatively sort of underexplained in terms of how much more this is actually producing for China relative to whatever costs gov teams have said. CO, then, what we do is show that this volatility structurally empowers the economic model the CCP has and is already taking. And first, we prove that this needs to only exist relatively, i.e., China just needs to be more sort of capable of responding to these things compared to democracies regionally, bigger international players, and then countries that are existing within the global south who become more insecure and more dependent on the networks and supply chains of China to create a favorable sort of margin in this benefit. The first thing I will do is respond to the both gov pushes here. First from CG. CG says Russia will lose, and now you've pigeoned yourself to like strategic sort of issues. First, it's really unclear why you're so publicly committed in the sense that these seem like favorable and convenient circumstantial sort of deals. When you do sell them stuff, you can also price these goods higher because now you're the only available supplier, given that sanctions already do like exist, and Russia being more desperate, needing these goods for military sort of services and basic sort of like maintaining their sort of infrastructure, given like CG's framing how much Russia is insecure, probably is more desperate, meaning that you can also price them higher. But the second thing they say is that China is actually dependent on Russia, and the fact that Russia is losing is bad. First, I want to say this is extremely speculative and contingent on Russia actually declining in their relative sort of power. I think the reason that this is speculative is because they actually have gained a lot of regional control and will probably get a favorable peace deal. They've also gained access to like the Donbass region and like favorable like pipelines there. Second, also the margin on Russian control and like, I don't know, Black Sea like decline versus like huge gains that we're giving you on like regional control and global south. Also, it's unclear like what these sorts of like losses actually mean for the CCP. I don't know. They're not clear about it. Second, then sanctions and spillovers and like all of the stuff, the main push from kind of OG as well. Then they say that China loses the EU market and they get pissed off because, you know, like you're evading like all of these international orders. First, I think we respond to this by saying there is a domestic legitimacy where you weaponize a lot of this type of volatility to be able to blame for economic crises that OO also conveniently frames within this debate, which is just to say that you become far more stable as kind of like as Western volatility increases. And when you have advantages in things like state propaganda and censorship, you can very easily spin these sorts of like Western aggression, evidence of these sorts of things. You can rally a lot of nationalist rhetoric, and you can actively then blame internal volatility on these sorts of things, which means that as volatility increases in relativistic terms, the domestic legitimacy you have is actually better because it gives you a far better sort of like way to pigeon or to at the very least blame a lot of these harms. The second thing I want to say is a defense of the capital flight claim for why like these sorts of things will actually go into Chinese markets, i.e. from like from the EU and stuff. One, when you need things like new trade routes and kind of like Western overextension, gives you like kind of the ability to do these, but also just the responses to CG here in terms of why they prefer Chinese markets, I think are pretty obvious. First, just given like inflationary and just like a lot of tightening like fiscally from America, you have a lot, or from countries generally, American capital is generally less attractive for the global south. China becomes a far more stable and alternative lender. And notably, then second, the over leveraging of the West in their commitments, i.e., American aversion to committing to like support of like, I don't know, South China Sea, Taiwan backing out of like, or at the very least, not committing to like Japan, South Korea, etc., means that the most likely implication, not what OO suggests, which is just like brute like expansionism, but rather that you can very easily bully actors who were previously resistant to you to now engage in things like favorable peace deals, trade, things that are economically beneficial to you. And the reason that this is more likely is that for American like security and intelligence, they have to maintain enough resources to have a credible threat within these sorts of Taiwan regions to kind of disincentivize you. So what you can uniquely do is weaponize the lack of sort of relationship they're maintaining, but the fact that they still have a credible threat to then impose your sort of way to bully these countries. But secondly, I think what you actively do is deepen a lot of these sorts of ties that you have within these sorts of regions. And what that means that you can better leverage those sorts of like advantages in whatever energy, security, whatever. The second thing I want to say in terms of OO here is that they assert that cheap Russian oil is helpful, i.e., like it, but they don't really explain kind of like how this outweighs a lot of the structural damage, things like sanctions spillovers and stuff. And I know I've mentioned this, so I'll actually like position it. The problem here is that there are enough responses from OG and CG on like how you can get alternative sorts of sources of oil and these sorts of margins that aren't clear. Actually, yeah, I'll take OG. Okay, cool. Yeah, so the reason that this is unclear is that they do really well on proving why you need fiscal stimulus, but less well on proving the extent of it. The premise of why you get fiscal stimulus is actually very clear on our side. Volatility creates shortages in things like food, so you lose a lot of like grains, energy, and credit for a lot of the global south in terms of like the extent to which they can gain favorable sort of like loans or and like can do that without imposing things like austerity measures, whatever. And China can very easily step in and supply these things. But secondly, even the benefits of things like discounted Russian oil is actually far more real on our side because you can sell them through Chinese markets, i.e., the sorts of like Russian goods that you have access to uniquely can be resold and repackaged and then sort of like distributed. And so what that means is that you deepen these sorts of dependency on specifically China and expand into a lot of these regions. And the comparative impact then is that you disrupting these sorts of supply chains, like Gov says, is outweighed because you benefit from being the alternative provider. This is a relativistic claim, which is why it is so important, even if in absolute, like the global economy or whatever, isn't as strong. And the second thing we feel here is just arguing that the CCP like actually just does, and the Chinese economy just does thrive in volatility. You can handle a lot of these shocks better. You can sort of like, I don't know, gain a lot of this legitimacy. And notably, the global south is the biggest consumer of your markets, right? They have the highest populations and for most of the goods that you're exporting. Secondly, you have more leverage in doing things like dumping goods because you're the only sort of like distributor. They have fewer regulation within their market, so you can easily enter and easily sort of like distribute these things. You also can easily outcompete local competition because it's not as strong, and especially as America sort of declines in their sort of investment within other countries itself. So what that means that you have unique sort of credibility as an alternative to a lot of that hypocrisy. Very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you everyone for what was a great debate and a good day of debating. I invite everyone to leave the round and my panelists and I will discuss. Let's review our flows and come back with initials in 2 minutes. Teams, please leave.